Hello. Have you got me now? Hello, can you hear me now? Hello, how's it going? You can hear me now. All right, I'm waiting for I've had the worst freaking morning. My phone's dead. I couldn't text anybody. I'm having the worst time. Okay, so we do have some concurrent viewers here. All right, they're coming back. My phone's about to kick in. I'm going to text them to have them come back to see us. Okay, I apologize for the technical difficulties. Let's go ahead and talk about this. Okay, and I know I've got a bunch of videos, Okay, hold on. Let me text real quick. Okay. Let me send an announcement out real quick. Sorry, technical details, period. I'm back online, period. Sorry, Oh, it's not going to do that. Technical problems. I'm online now. Okay, so do we have anybody here? How many people have we lost because of my silliness so far? Okay, there are 3 of us. Oh, it's terrible. Yeah, it's terrible. And my car's about out of gas. In fact, I hope I can make it to the gas station. Just a weird morning for me. And let me see. Hold on. Jesus Christ. It gets even worse because I don't know where my coffee is. Okay. Wow. Worst morning ever. Okay. Let's go ahead and get started. Thanks for coming today. I do apologize with the technical difficulties. I promise everything will be good from here on out because I'm going to start streaming in my office instead of going to I'm going to start streaming from my school office rather than my home office. I promise you, I swear to God, Juliet, I will get in touch with you about your exam. I promise I've seen your emails and your text, and you sent me a copy of your answers, so I promise I'll take care of everything for you, okay? Medina, good to see you. Let's talk a little bit about IQ testing, shall we? All right, let's go ahead. I'm assuming my sound's coming through well. Now, today we're going to be talking a little bit, next couple of days, we're going to be talking a little bit about this thing we'll call intelligence. It's a measuring of human ability. So intelligence is one of the areas where we began this idea of trying to classify human beings to see if they differed in some sort of major qualities that was important for life skills. Intelligence is, you can think of that as your ability to use knowledge, to reason, to make decisions, to make sense of events, to solve problems, to understand complex ideas, to learn quickly, and to adapt to environmental challenge. Now, you'll notice that this definition doesn't say anything about facts. It only talks about processes, using knowledge to reason, to make decisions, to make events, to solve problems. Intelligence is not knowledge. Now, knowledge may factor into your intelligence, but intelligence is a human quality that relates to your ability to learn instead of just what you know. All right? Now, we're going to ask questions like, can you even describe what intelligence is coherently? What exactly is intelligence? I've talked to you and I've suggested that intelligence is a lot of cognitive abilities, making decisions, solving problems, reasoning. But you might say, hey, is creativity a form of intelligence as well? Is your ability to make things artistically with your hands, is that a form of intelligence? So we're going to ask the question, Can we even describe intelligence coherently? The second question we're going to talk about is there a human quality that we can measure and use to evaluate people on? And can it be applied to human functioning? And so I'm going to ask you, what does it mean to be intelligent? Here are several different people. We have Albert Einstein over here. We've got this spelling bee championship. You got a rap star, a television star, and a big Google exec. And all of these people demonstrate capabilities, qualities, amazing abilities, but do they demonstrate intelligence? That's what we're going to wonder today. Okay, modern IQ testing. Now, I don't know if you know this, but we're going to specifically, the biggest part of the search for intelligence has been the search for this thing called IQ. IQ is related to intelligence, but as I'm going to describe on tomorrow, IQ is not all of what it means to be intelligent. Instead, IQ is probably what we would call classical school-related intelligence. IQ is that ability that allows you to do well in academic settings. I don't know if you know this, but you folks are in the middle of the testing century. I'm sure that you've been tested since you've been in school. You've been taking end of grade tests, national tests, CAT tests, SAT tests, all kinds of different tests. You are part of the testing generation. And all of this started with IQ tests over about 100 years ago. Where exactly are you going to find IQ tests? You know what? You're going to find IQ tests everywhere. You're going to find them in schools. You're going to find them in courts. You're going to find them in therapists' office. And you're even going to find them in business settings. And if you look over to my left, you'll see what we're talking about. So these people called school psychologists, remember we talked about them in chapter 1. Those are the people that help students who are having difficulty in a school setting. And these school psychologists, sometimes they use paper and pencil tests, and we all took IQ tests in 3rd grade to figure out who went to gifted and talented programs. The AP programs are your accelerated school programs. And then sometimes these clinical psychologists will use these individually, they'll administer an IQ test individually to help a child that may have a learning disorder or some other developmental problem which is preventing them from doing well at school. Forensic psychologists are those psychologists that you'll find in school settings, and you'll sometimes find them in those big heavy-duty criminal cases where they're trying to establish that a defendant was either competent or incompetent to stand trial for their crimes. And sometimes you'll find them in family courts where they may be using IQ tests as part of the evaluation process to find where the children should best be placed, which parent the children should be with. You know what? You're going to find clinical psychologists. Remember, that's another area of specialty. So we've got all these different areas of specialties using IQ tests. I don't want that point to be lost on you. Clinical psychologists, when you go in and you have some sort of problem that you wanted to have looked at, if a patient has schizophrenia or bipolar or borderline personality or some of these more severe psychological disorders, clinical psychologists will use IQ tests as part of the evaluation process because the person's level of intellectual functioning is going to be relevant to the case at hand. And I don't know if you knew this, but businesses are using IQ tests now. I don't know if you remember this subspecialty we talked about, industrial organizational psychologists. That's another subfield of psychology. And so they use IQ tests to classify and evaluate candidates for hiring. I don't know if you know this, but the NFL uses an IQ test. They give all the potential draftees this test called the Wonderlic. And if you listen real carefully during the drafts, the football drafts, at some point, one of those draft people is going to talk about a quarterback's Wonderlic score. Either it's really high and everyone's impressed, or it's really low and they make snide remarks. And there was a court case recently. Men have a mechanical aptitude test. Absolutely, Tapia. And an aptitude, an IQ test is an aptitude, but it would be what we might call an abstract thinking aptitude test. So they're sort of the same thing. An aptitude test is your ability to learn, and they want to know how good could you be with tools and whatnot. That's great. And yeah, I was going to tell you, there was a court case recently. Connecticut Police Department turned down a candidate because his IQ score was too high. And their research had shown that people with IQ scores too high found being a policeman boring and quit the job. And so they didn't want to train somebody who would be likely to quit the force. And did you know what? I'm not sure if it went to the Supreme Court, but this gentleman actually lost in court. And it turns out it is legal for the police to select you based on your IQ score. As long as they apply it similarly to everybody, they can do that. But basically what they said is you can have too high an IQ to be a policeman. Kind of interesting. Now, Lewis brings up a good point. He said a mechanical aptitude test. Look at that word aptitude. That's what I want you to pay attention to. Now, an IQ test is an aptitude. Now, remember, when I went back and I talked about the description of intelligence, I said it's really more process than content. So it's your ability to reason, to make decisions, to make sense of things, to solve problems, to understand. It's your ability to learn. Okay, and so an IQ test is what we call an aptitude test. It's supposed to evaluate your overall ability to learn, not just a set of facts, but how quickly you could learn. So an IQ test is an aptitude test. We're going to differentiate aptitude tests from what they call achievement tests. So the exam that you took in my class this past weekend was an achievement test. I was evaluating whether or not you learned chapters 4 through 7 in this class. Now, if you made a 100 on this test, does this mean you're a genius? Nope. Just means you learned the material I asked you to learn. If you made a 43 on this test, does that mean you're not intelligent? Nope. It just means that you weren't able to remember the facts that I wanted you to remember for this exam. This was an achievement test, an end of grade test that asks you whether or not you learned stuff that happened in second grade or stuff that happened in third grade, or an achievement test like your final exam in psychology or final exam in math. Those are what we would call achievement tests, right? And so the IQ tests are going to be a little bit different from all other tests because they're going to focus on how clever you are, if you will. Does that make sense? I don't know, how many people do I still have in the broadcast? If I lost a lot of people, 4, not too bad. Okay. All right, fantastic. Now, Alfred Renee, the first IQ tests were actually invented in France by this fellow named Alfred Renee. He was asked by the French government to design a test to identify kids who might need extra resources or special education. So I don't know if you've ever been in class, especially early in education before they start making these evaluations. There may be somebody in class who's really having trouble picking up things as quickly as the other children are. Well, the French government, just like was the first to figure out that these children might benefit from extra help. And so what they wanted was a way to systematically select these children that might profit from extra help. And so they asked Alfred Renee to come up with a test. And he came up with a 30-question test with question items going from super easy to super hard. And what he believed was that he could use this test to measure the functional age of your mind. So, are you thinking like a 2-year-old? Are you thinking like a 3-year-old? Are you thinking like a 5-year-old or a 6-year-old, right? All right. Has any of you ever heard of being above grade level or below grade level? Do you remember ever being evaluated in school by your school and coming home and telling your parents, well, I'm reading at a 5th grade level and I'm only in 4th grade, or I'm reading at a 3rd grade level and I'm only in 2nd grade? Has anybody ever had that experience in school? That's sort of the logic that this guy Alfred Renee used. So he figured he could judge your mental ability, your age of your mind, and he could compare that to your chronological age to see if you were above or ahead or behind. So for example, if you were a 6-year-old and he gave you this test and he evaluated your mind to be the mind of a 6-year-old, then your mental age would be the same as your chronological age. You would be a 1. You would be right on time. But let's say, for example, when he tested your mind came up at the age of a 9-year-old. Wow, little Lewis reasons like a 9-year-old boy. But little Lewis is only 6. So then the chronological age divided by the mental age divided by the chronological age would be 1.5. And we would say, wow, Lewis Tapia is really ahead of schedule. On the other hand, we might measure my IQ, and I might be 9 years old, but when he tests my mind, he says, Chris's mind is the mind of a 6-year-old. Well, I'm a mental age of a 6-year-old divided by 9, which is my regular age. I would be a 0.67. All right. And so what he used was sort of this ratio method. He thought he could figure out how old your mind was, and he would compare it to how old your age was to see if you were on time, ahead, or behind. Now, decimal points always make people confused. So the IQ test that you're familiar with doesn't use decimal points. What they do is they multiply it out times 100. So you get rid of the decimal points. And so now, if you take an IQ test and you score 100 on an IQ test, that's 1. Add 2 spots, take away the decimal places, right? 100 is average. And if instead of getting Lewis being a 1.5, he would now be a 150, a 150. Okay, and I, instead of being a 0.67, a 6-year-old with the mind of a 9-year-old, instead of being a 0.67, I would be a 67. But the idea behind this test is he would compare you to your mental age, your chronological age to your mental age, to see if you were ahead or behind. Now, he did this for French school children. The first test over here in America was done by a fellow named William Stern, who renormed this test to find out what the average 6-year-old American kid knew and the average 9-year-old American kid knew. And he got rid of the decimal points. And that became known as the Stanford-Binet IQ test. Now, that test is actually still in use today. It is the oldest IQ test in the world, the Stanford-Binet IQ test. Now, here's the deal. IQ tests, after they were invented, the American military got the bright idea that they could use this newly invented test. The test had been brought over to America in 1912. World War I think we got involved in it. I think it was the last year, like 1916, 1917. We got involved in World War I. And this test had just been invented. And so the military thought, wow, what a great idea. We bring in lots of recruits, and this will allow us to cleverly classify them and find out who we should give the most difficult jobs to. So the first widespread use of IQ testing in the world was used by the United States military during World War I. And they used this test to classify these U.S. soldiers. It was called the Army Alpha Test. But I'll bet you folks probably know it by its newer name. Have any of you taken the Asvab test, the Armed Services Vocational Aptitude Battery? How many of you have taken that? I'll bet at least 2 or 3 of you have, right? Now, this test was wildly popular, and suddenly schools realized, hey, maybe we can use this to start classifying our students in second and third grade. Maybe we can use this to decide more fairly who should go to the best colleges or the worst colleges. Because back in 1912, you got into Harvard not because you were smart, but because your daddy was rich and knew people. And if you grew up in Oklahoma, it didn't matter how smart you were never getting to Harvard because you didn't have the right connections. With the Scholastic Aptitude test, what's that middle word, Lewis? Aptitude. The Scholastic Aptitude test is a version of the IQ test that allowed us to classify all high school seniors to see who was the cleverest of the high school seniors. So the popularity of the test in the military in World War I led to the explosion in the use of IQ tests. And now each and every one of you, at least here in America, I know we have an international audience, but some of you, if you grew up in America, you took an IQ test in third grade. And if you scored really high on it, they gave you a second IQ test. And if you scored really high on that one, they put you in gifted education. Now, there are lots of different kinds of tests that you're going to find in school. If you do the one for gifted education that they give to all third grade students, that's a paper and pencil test. It's the most popular paper and pencil test of IQ. That's where they give you written questions and you mark in the bubbles, giving the right answers. The ACT. Now, that's interesting that you should mention the ACT. Now, the ACT was designed as an achievement test, because here's the crazy thing. You could do poorly in school. You didn't necessarily have to learn all the material you were supposed to in high school to score well on the old SAT, because it was an aptitude test. And one of the complaints that led to the creation of the ACT was that some people said that these college readiness exams, instead of being like IQ tests, they should be more achievement oriented, measuring whether or not you actually learned the facts that were taught in high school. That's interesting, Lewis. And ever since then, there's been sort of this competition between the ACT and the SAT tests. And most of your colleges on the coast, now this has changed in 30 years since I was a student, but back when I was a student, the colleges on the coasts, the East Coast and the West Coast, preferred to have the SAT, the Scholastic Aptitude test, while the schools in the middle part of the country preferred the more achievement-oriented ACT test. That's interesting that you took that. Did you take the SAT as well, Lewis? Now, so the Woodcock-Johnson is one test. The Asvab is that IQ test for military recruits. I mentioned to you earlier that the Wonderlic test is sort of an IQ test, a real short, I think it's 25 or 50 item IQ test that can be administered in a few minutes, and it's used in business settings. And I specifically mentioned to you it's in the NFL. Actually, Google highest or lowest Wonderlic score in NFL, and I guarantee you there will be somebody blogging about this quarterback's really high Wonderlic score, or this quarterback's really low Wonderlic score. Now, the only ones I haven't mentioned are these Wechsler Scales. Now, one of the things that I haven't mentioned is there are two ways to administer an IQ test. You can administer an IQ test individually in a one-on-one setting, and they were originally developed to be administered in a one-on-one setting. And in a one-on-one setting, I can look, as the psychologist, I can evaluate to see if you're having any other problems not related to intelligence that might keep you from doing well on the test. So for example, let's say, Lewis, I sent you over to France and gave you the Woodcock-Johnson written in French. You would score really low on the Woodcock-Johnson, Lewis, because you don't speak French. And I would never know that if I gave you a pencil and paper test, you would just score really poorly, and the number would say, wow, Lewis is below average in intelligence, and that would be wrong. In a one-on-one setting, I can look and see if you're having attention problems, if you're having physical pain, if you have trouble with the language that the test is in. I can use I can evaluate all of these other things. And when you're testing someone's IQ in a setting for clinical purposes, you really need to do this careful evaluation of their other extrasensory abilities that might impact an IQ score. So in clinical settings, IQ tests are always given in a one-on-one setting. So if you go to a therapist and your psychologist wants you to take an IQ test, they'll probably test you themselves in a one-on-one setting. If your child has a learning disorder or has been diagnosed and has an IEP, chances are they were given an IQ test in a one-on-one setting. And the IQ test that's given in one-on-one settings is the Wechsler Scales, or at least that's the most popular, the Wechsler Scales. And so the Woodcock-Johnson, the Asvab, the Wonderlic, those are given in pencil and paper form. Now, those have a different purpose. Those are not designed to identify problems in functioning. Those tests are designed for a, quote, normal population, just to compare and classify. So the assumption is, if you're in these settings, you don't have these clinically significant problems that you would find in other populations. So they give you the pencil and paper test. It's quicker, it's easier. You can do it 100 or 1,000 people at the time. On the other hand, in a clinical setting with the Wechsler scale, I do it in a one-on-one setting. It might take a half an hour or 45 minutes of my time to test you, and then I have to go and score the items. So it may take me an hour and a half to do one person. Okay, that's expensive, but we do that in clinical settings where it's important, where there's the potential that the person falls into one of the extremes of intelligence. Now, there are 3 different kinds of Wechsler scales. Did you know that IQ can be reliably measured starting at the age of 4? At the age of 4 years of age, you can begin measuring a person's IQ, getting a consistent measure of a person's IQ. So the Wechsler scales, this David Wechsler has an IQ test for preschool kids. It's called the WIPSI, the Wechsler Primary and Preschool Test of Intelligence. And then he has a test for children from 6 to around, supposed to be 6 to 16, but 6 to around 14 or 15 is called the WISC, the Wechsler Intelligence Scale for Children. And then he has a test that is primarily designed for people 15 to 16 and over, sort of your adult intelligence. That's called the WAIS, the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale. And the reason you do that is because the same questions that'll be hard for a 4-year-old are not going to be very hard for your average 30 or 35-year-old. So they have these tests set to different levels of knowledge. Now, let's say you get somebody, let's say you get a patient who's a 35-year-old, but they have severe Down syndrome. And typically with Down syndrome, you're going to get an intellectual deficiency, which can be measured on an IQ test. That person may be, that case may be so severe that given them the adult WAIS, it doesn't even make sense. So you might actually give them the different level test and take that into account. But usually the test questions are set so they're appropriate to measure that given age group. Now that leads me to my second point. Using my brother has Down syndrome, okay, really? All right, I have let's see, he's my brother's son, so he'd be my nephew. I have a nephew with Down syndrome as well. And he's a wonderful guy, fairly high functioning, and he smiles a lot. He's great to be around. But he just has a little trouble with problem solving and doesn't have the skills that would allow him to live on his own. He lives he's made his own little apartment in my brother's garage, and he kind of has his own little apartment set up that he can go to and have his own space. But Julia, you probably know the IQ test is going to show that maybe there's a little difficulty when it comes to the problem-solving abilities. Now, here's the deal. IQ test using the ratio method doesn't make sense for adults. For example, I'm 52. What would it mean to say I have the mind of a 75-year-old? Would that be a good thing? In an IQ test, having a mental age much older than your chronological age would be a good thing. Let's say I'm a 52-year-old and my mental age is that of a 40-year-old. Does that make sense? The deviation, the ratio method that was pioneered for the use in children doesn't make sense for adults. So modern IQ scores now have switched to a method that can be used for children as well as adults. And this is called the deviation method. And in the deviation method, what you do is you compare children or adults to others of the same age. And what you do is you compare their scores on a test. So let's say the modern IQ test has 100 questions. What we're going to do is compare how many questions you get correctly, and some of the questions are timed, and we're going to see how quickly you can do these questions. And what we're going to do is we're going to be able to arrange you from the person that does the best on that test to the person that does the worst on that test. And so we're going to get all the 13-year-olds and we're going to test them, and we're going to see what the best score is, what the worst score is, and what the 50th percentile test score is. Does that make sense? And so every 10 years, what IQ test people do is they go out and they get a representative sample of each age group, and they give them the test, and they renorm the test and find out what the 50th percentile is. Now, it turns out that if you give 1,000 people an IQ test and have them take it and rank their scores and do a frequency distribution. So in a frequency distribution, you give a person one little check every time they score that. And the more people, the higher up the y-axis your line goes. So if you look at this frequency distribution, this represents all 100% of the people who take the IQ test. And what you're going to notice is that about 5% of your people are going to fall at the very, very extremes. 2.3 are going to score at the very, very top, and 2.3 are going to score very, very low, right? But not that many people are going to be at the extremes. What you're going to find is that most people's scores are going to fall somewhere in the middle. So if you can get 100 questions right, only a few people are going to get all 100 questions. And only a few people are going to miss almost all 100 questions. But a lot of people are going to fall somewhere in the middle. And what you're going to find is that most of the people, 68.3% of the people, are going to fall very close to the middle. Now, these dashed lines you see are what we call standard deviations. When you calculate an average, I'm sure you folks know what an average is, right? An average score, as might be on your test. I think the average exam score was an 82 on this last exam. Now, there is a measure called standard deviation, which is how far on average do the scores fall away from the mean. And so it's called the average variance, if you will. So the average score was an 80, all right? But not very many people scored 80. Some people scored 78, some people scored 85. So if you scored 78, you were 2 below the mean. If you scored 85, you were 5 above the mean. And so taken together, that person was 5 above the mean, this person was 2 above the mean. If you average their scores, on average, they were about 3.5 points from the mean. What you can do with an IQ distribution is if you look at the scores, you're going to find that there's a mean, an average score. It's sort of bell-shaped, and there's sort of going to be some people in the middle, and you're going to find that over 2/3 of the population are going to fall within that average distance from the mean. So 68% of the people that take an IQ test are going to fall somewhere in the middle of that bell curve. We're going to call those people average. Now, you'll notice the score down at the bottom is a 100. Does that mean they got 100 questions right? No, absolutely it does not at all. It means that their standardized score, they may have gotten 50 scores, but we're setting 100 as the arbitrary average or the standardized average score. And what we're going to do is we're going to give you a different standard score based upon how far away from this mean you are. Those people that score from 85 to 115 are what we would call average in IQ. They score somewhere in the average group. From 85 to 70 is below average. From 115 to 130 is going to be above average. Above 130, we're going to call these people gifted. And then now, down at the bottom, below 70, these people, depending on their ability to function, may be given a diagnosis of intellectual disability. That used to be called mental retardation. They call it intellectual disability now. Okay, but just because you score 65 or 64 on an IQ test does not mean you get the label of intellectual disability, because some people have dyslexia so bad, some people have math disorder so bad, some people may have a verbal physical defect which causes them from doing well on the IQ test, but this person can still function and keep a job and take care of their bills and raise children and do all the difficult adult things are. If you can manage your abilities, you would never get that diagnosis of intellectual disability. Now, my nephew with the Down syndrome, he scored in the mid-60s on an IQ test, but here's the deal. He couldn't live on his own. He didn't quite have the ability to manage a bank account, to rent a place. He didn't have the ability to get a car or to pay attention enough to drive a car. So he couldn't take care of himself, and his IQ was below 70. He would get the diagnosis of intellectual disability. But some people are just going to be so profoundly bad at school-related stuff that they may score 67 or 68, but if they're still getting it on and taking care of their day-to-day abilities, you would never see that diagnosis applied to these people. Okay? Now, and so this is how we do modern IQ tests. And I'm going to spend tomorrow talking about what these tests actually measure. But so what I want to do to learn from today, all right, is that IQ test is an attempt to measure human ability. What is this human ability? I'm not sure. We think it's some sort of process that involves making decisions, making sense, solving problems, understanding complex ideas. We're going to try to describe it, but we're going to know that it's hard to describe coherently. We're going to try to measure it, and we're going to try to use it to help us impact people's lives. Now, where are you going to see IQ tests? In the last 100 years, they've spread and they're used by a wide variety of psychologists in a wide variety of fields. School psychologists, forensic psychologists, clinical psychologists, and industrial psychologists, IO psychologists, all use IQ tests in their settings to help to do different tasks. Remember, an IQ test is an aptitude test as opposed to an achievement test. The first guy to create this IQ test was a fellow named Alfred Renee in France. I'm going to ask you both his name and his country. I'm going to go ahead and warn you. Remember, Alfred Renee from France, all right? And his first test would use this ratio method where he wanted to find out how clever you were compared to your age. So were you thinking like your age, or were you thinking ahead of your age, right? Now, his test was so freaking popular that it came over the United States, where a fellow named William Stern created an American version of it right here. Now, this test was used by the military to great effect in World War I, which led to the rise, the explosion of the use of IQ scores in America that would then be followed by the rest of the world to one degree or another. Now, this IQ test became that the military used is known as the Asvab test, and I'd mentioned to you a couple of other pencil and paper tests, and I wanted you to know that pencil and paper tests are great for people when we just want to classify normal populations. But if we really, really want to diagnose some sort of psychological problem, some sort of learning disorder, we have to use a one-on-one test, and the most popular one's the Wechsler Scale. And then I wanted you to know that the Wechsler Scale in these modern tests, instead of trying to compare your mental age to your chronological age, because that doesn't make sense for adults, they instead compare you to your age group, And what I want to know is, how do you score relative to the median, the middle score of your age group? Are you ahead of that middle score, or are you behind that middle score? And how far are you? If you're farther than, if you're outside the middle 68%, we can start talking about above and below average. And then those people at the extreme scores on this thing called an IQ test may have labels assigned to them given to their situation. Now, we didn't get a time to talk about it, but I'm going to talk about the breakdown of an IQ test and genetics in IQ test tomorrow, and then we'll talk about more modern conceptions of IQ tests. I am super duper sorry for being late today to class. I know I ruined the lecture and only 3 of you managed to stay, but I do appreciate your sticking with me today. Thanks, and I promise we will start on time tomorrow because I'm coming straight to my office at 7 or 8 o'clock. So we won't have any guesswork tomorrow for the rest of the semester. If you don't have any questions, I'm going to go ahead and say goodbye. Take care. It was great seeing everybody, and I look forward to seeing you tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. And Juliet, I promise I will handle your exams sometime later today, probably by 2 p.m. All right, folks, take care. Have a great day, and I will see you tomorrow. Bye.